Roland Mercer rode onto Gideon Cross's land without invitation, without warning, and without a single moment of hesitation. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He simply dismounted, walked straight to the front porch, and left a folded letter wedged into the doorframe like he owned the place. Because in his mind, he already owned everything that mattered, including the woman sheltering inside. The letter had 3 sentences. The third one read, "A woman like you should be grateful anyone bothered to look twice." Gideon found Beatrice holding that letter by the kitchen window, her hands perfectly still, her face unreadable in a way that was somehow worse than crying. That moment told him everything he needed to know about the man riding back down his road. If you've ever watched someone you respect get treated like they were worth less than the dirt beneath their boots, drop a like, leave a comment with your city or country so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Stories like this one, they don't end the way Roland Mercer expects. The letter that started everything wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly well written. Gideon Cross had drafted it 3 times over 2 evenings, crossing out sentences that sounded too desperate or too proud, until what remained was plain enough to be honest. Seeking a capable woman, ranch work, shared management, fair arrangement. He'd left out the part about the leaking roof, the part about the eastern fence that had collapsed in 2 places and hadn't been repaired since April, the part about the cattle count dropping from 63 head to 41 over the course of a single bad winter, and how the numbers in his ledger had stopped adding up to anything resembling a future somewhere around February. He posted the notice in Cartwell, the nearest town with a dry goods store and a post office, and then he rode home and tried not to think about it. That was a mistake. Thinking about it was all he did. 3 weeks passed. The silence from Cartwell felt pointed, like the land itself was confirming what he already suspected, that a struggling ranch with a reputation for hard luck wasn't exactly drawing competition. He'd heard the talk. Everyone in the valley had an opinion about the Cross homestead. Most of those opinions involved the word doomed delivered with a kind of satisfied certainty that people reserved for things they'd secretly been expecting. On the 22nd day, a single reply arrived. Gideon read it twice, standing beside the post office counter, then folded it carefully and rode home without stopping for supplies. Her name was Beatrice Hollow. She wrote in clear, unhurried sentences that moved from one practical point to the next without wasted space. She had managed accounts for a dry goods operation in Harlan County for 6 years. She knew livestock, knew preservation, knew how to stretch a household budget across a season that didn't cooperate. She wasn't looking for ease. She said that directly, without apology. I understand ranch work is physical and unforgiving. I don't need it to be otherwise. She didn't mention her appearance. She didn't mention anything personal at all, which Gideon later understood was its own kind of statement. She was applying to run a ranch, not to be evaluated. He wrote back the same evening. 2 days later, she confirmed she would arrive by wagon on the 15th. He spent the morning of the 15th fixing the worst of the porch steps, which had developed a dangerous sag near the left post. It wasn't the most urgent repair on the property, not by a long reach, but it was the one he could finish before noon. The wagon came up the road just past 2 in the afternoon. Gideon was standing near the barn when it pulled in. He'd been checking on a cow that had been off her feed for 3 days. The kind of low-grade worry that sat in the back of his mind while the rest of him tried to focus on other things. He straightened up when he heard the wheels and walked to meet the wagon, wiping his hands on the side of his trousers. Beatrice Hollow climbed down without waiting for help. She was a heavy woman, solidly built, her dress a practical dark blue that had been washed enough times to lose its original brightness. She landed with a firm, unhurried step and immediately turned to look at the property with the focused attention of someone doing mental arithmetic. Her eyes moved to the barn first, then to the fence line visible on the eastern side, then to the garden beds near the south wall of the house that had been left to go scraggly over the summer. She didn't look at Gideon for a long moment. He'd been prepared for awkwardness. What he hadn't expected was to stand there feeling like the one being assessed. "Mr. Cross?" she said finally, turning to face him. Her voice was even, without performance. "The eastern fence." "I know," he said. "When did it go down?" "Spring. 2 sections in March, 1 more in May." She nodded slowly. The cattle aren't grazing the south field. No. Because of the fence. Yes. So you've been running them on the north pasture exclusively. That's right. She looked at the north pasture. That field's going to be grazed past recovery before winter if you keep that rotation. Gideon said nothing, because she was correct. The barn roof, she said. Back left corner. He looked at her. It's sagging, she said. I can see it from here. Snow accumulation is going to be a problem. I was going to get to it. When? It wasn't an accusation. The question was flat and practical, the kind a doctor might ask when you said you were going to take care of something. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. Beatrice turned back to the house. Can I see the ledger? They sat at the kitchen table with the account books open between them while the afternoon light shifted from bright to long. Gideon poured 2 cups of water and watched her work through the numbers without speaking. She had a way of reading through figures that was methodical and slightly unnerving, her finger moving down columns with an expression that gave nothing away. After about 20 minutes, she set the pen down. You've been spending on feed for 41 animals on a budget that was designed for 60, she said. That's not wrong, but your supplier is charging you individually instead of on bulk weight. You're losing somewhere between $4 and $7 every delivery. Gideon stared at her. Harmon's been supplying us for 3 years. I know. That's probably why you didn't notice. She wasn't accusing him of stupidity. She was simply identifying a fact. The vegetable garden on the south side. What's it producing? Not much. Some squash, beans earlier in the summer. Why haven't you expanded it? I haven't had the time. If we expand it by the end of September, we can get a late yield in before frost. Combined with proper preservation, that's a significant reduction in winter food costs. She made a note in her own small ledger, which she'd apparently brought with her in her bag. Gideon watched her write and felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too light for what was underneath it. It was something closer to the feeling of stepping onto solid ground after walking on ice for too long. That mix of relief and embarrassment at having stayed on the ice as long as you had. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. You had one response to that notice, he said. Why? Beatrice was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I don't know how many responses you received. I only know about mine. 1, he said. You were the only one. She considered that. I imagine the situation as you described it didn't appeal to many people. And it appealed to you? I didn't say that. She picked up the pen again. I said I was qualified for it. Those aren't the same thing. That first night, she slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. Gideon had cleared it out the week before and put in a decent mattress and a chest for her things. She thanked him without excess and closed the door at 9 o'clock. He sat on the porch for a while in the dark, listening to the cattle settle and thinking about nothing in particular. The ledger numbers she'd identified kept arranging themselves in his head. $4 to $7 per delivery. He'd been losing that amount for 3 years without knowing it. He went to bed eventually, but not easily. The first week was a reckoning, not a dramatic one. It didn't announce itself with arguments or confrontations. It arrived the way most significant things do, quietly, through accumulated small moments that each individually seemed minor, but together added up to something you couldn't ignore. Beatrice began with the supply sheds. Gideon had 3. One attached to the barn, one behind the house, and one smaller structure near the eastern fence that had originally been a grain storage but had accumulated years of miscellaneous material, broken tools, empty crates, a rusted chain harness that predated his ownership of the property. She went through all 3 in 2 days, working from shortly after dawn until the light started failing. He offered to help. She told him she'd let him know when she needed him. He spent those 2 days feeling vaguely useless, which was not a sensation he was accustomed to on his own property. On the evening of the second day, she came in from the shed with a list. 3 of your tools need repair, not replacement, she said, setting the paper on the table. I've marked which ones. The chain harness is scrap, but the metal is good. There's a blacksmith in Cartwell who would take it for trade, probably worth $2 to $3 in credit towards something useful. The broken wheel brace can be fixed with about an hour of work. I can do it tomorrow if you have the materials. Or you can, whichever is more efficient. I'll do it, he said. Good. She sat down and opened her ledger. I also found 12 empty feed bags stacked in the back shed. He waited. Harmons charges you a bag deposit, she said. You're supposed to return them for credit. Gideon stared at the table. He had absolutely no memory of that arrangement. How long have you been keeping those bags? She asked. I don't know, 2 years maybe? She wrote something down. When I go to Cartwell to renegotiate the feed contract, I'll bring the bags. You're going to renegotiate the feed contract? Yes. Harmon's been supplying you for 3 years, she said. I know. That's why he thinks the current terms are fixed. They're not. She didn't say it with relish, just certainty. He'd rather renegotiate than lose the account entirely. A ranch trending in the right direction is worth keeping as a client. Gideon sat with that for a moment. You sound pretty sure we're trending in the right direction. Beatrice looked at him for a moment with an expression he was starting to learn, the one that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't nothing either. That's the job, she said simply. The next morning, Gideon fixed the wheel brace. He also started on the eastern fence, which he should have tackled in March but hadn't, because in March the weight of everything that needed doing had made it hard to start anything at all. That was something he didn't say to Beatrice, but he thought she might have understood it anyway. News traveled in ranch country the way water found its level, slowly, then all at once, and usually downhill. By the end of the second week, the neighboring ranchers knew there was a woman at the crossplace. By the beginning of the third, they'd formed opinions, as people in that particular stretch of territory were inclined to do with great efficiency and limited information. Porter Wills, whose property ran along the north boundary, was the first to make his assessment directly to Gideon. He rode up while Gideon was working the fence line, stopped his horse, and looked toward the house. Heard you found someone, Porter said. Word gets around. A woman. Porter said it like he was testing the weight of the word. Heavy set, they're saying, from over near Harlan County. That's right. Porter chewed on something. She going to last the season? Why wouldn't she? Well, he adjusted his hat. Frontier work's demanding. Not everyone's built for it. Gideon kept working the fence post. She reorganized my entire supply operation in 2 days and found a billing error Harmon's been running on me for 3 years. So far, I'd say she's managing. Porter didn't have an immediate answer for that. He rode off a few minutes later with the satisfied expression of a man who had gathered information and would distribute it efficiently. Gideon didn't mention the conversation to Beatrice. He wasn't sure she needed to hear it, and he wasn't sure he knew how to frame it without it sounding like he was defending her, which felt presumptuous. She hadn't asked him to. 2 days later, she came in from Cartwell with the renegotiated feed contract and $12 in account credit from the returned feed bags. She put the credit slip on the table and looked at him with the closest thing to satisfaction he'd seen from her. Harmon tried to tell me bulk pricing didn't apply to accounts under 60 head, she said, sitting down and pulling off her gloves. I told him we'd be back at 60 head by spring, and that I'd heard McCready's over in Dunbar was looking to reduce his suppliers. Is McCready actually looking? I have no idea, she said. But Harmon doesn't know that. Gideon laughed. He hadn't done that in long enough that it surprised him slightly when it came out. Beatrice looked at him with that almost expression again, then looked back at her ledger. The credit went toward a new section of fence post material. By the end of the week, all 3 collapsed sections of the eastern fence were repaired and the cattle were rotating properly between the north and south pastures for the first time in 5 months. The south field had more in it than Gideon remembered. It was Porter Wills's wife, Delia, who brought the first real friction. She arrived one afternoon while Beatrice was in the garden, uninvited and carrying a basket she probably intended as cover for the visit. Gideon saw her coming up the road and felt the particular tension of someone arriving with an agenda they hadn't announced. Delia Wills was not a cruel woman. She was the kind of person who believed she was being kind even when she wasn't, which Gideon had always found harder to navigate than outright unkindness. She found Beatrice in the garden without coming through the house, and Gideon, who was nearby working on the barn roof corner, could hear the exchange with uncomfortable clarity. I wanted to see how you were settling in, Delia said warmly, in the voice she used for charitable purposes. You must be finding it quite challenging. It's work, Beatrice said. I came for work. Of course. A pause. It's just that ranch life out here is very physical, the winters especially. I hope you're not overextending yourself. Gideon stopped what he was doing. There was a silence from the garden. I appreciate the concern, Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly even. I've done harder work in worse conditions. But thank you. I only meant... I know what you meant. Not angry, just clear. Was there something else? Delia Wills left about 10 minutes later with her basket, the charitable errand unfulfilled. Gideon climbed down from the barn roof and went to find Beatrice. She was back at work in the garden, her hands moving through the soil with that steady efficiency he'd come to expect from her. You heard that, she said without looking up. Some of it. You don't need to say anything. I wasn't going to. He crouched down near the edge of the beds, looking at what she'd planted. What is all this? Late beans, turnips, winter squash, if we're lucky on the timing. She sat back on her heels. I'm extending the south bed by about 4 feet. We have enough seed. He looked at the beds, then at her. Delia Wills isn't the worst of it, he said. In case you were wondering. Beatrice looked at him directly. I know. People around here. I know, she said again. There was something tired in it, but not defeated. It was the tiredness of someone who has heard the same thing enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. I've lived in my body my whole life, Mr. Cross. I'm not unfamiliar with how people look at it. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say that wouldn't have made it worse. She went back to working the soil. He went back to the barn roof. But something had shifted between them that afternoon. Not dramatically, not in any way either of them would have been able to name if asked. Just a small, quiet movement, like a door that wasn't quite latched, finally settling closed. The first major test came in the 3rd week. One of the older cows, a roan named by no one because Gideon had never been the naming type, went down in the north pasture just before evening. He found her lying on her side, breathing shallow, and felt the specific dread of a man who couldn't afford a veterinarian and couldn't afford to lose the animal. He went to the house. Beatrice was at the table with her ledger. She looked up when he came in, read his face immediately, and was on her feet before he said a word. They spent 4 hours with that cow in the cooling evening, Beatrice working with the focused calm of someone who had done this before, which turned out she had. Her family had kept cattle when she was young, and she'd helped through enough difficult nights to know what she was doing. She identified a blockage. She worked it through with her hands, talking to the animal in a low, even voice the whole time. Not in the sentimental way some people talk to livestock, but in the practical way of someone communicating that everything was going to be handled. Near midnight, the cow stood up. She stood there swaying slightly, then walked to the water trough and drank. Gideon let out a breath he'd been holding for approximately 4 hours. She'll need watching for a few days, Beatrice said, straightening up and cleaning her hands. But she's past the worst of it. Gideon looked at her. Where did you learn that? My father's farm. We had a herd. Couldn't afford to lose animals either. She dried her hands on a cloth. It's not that different from what you'd do for a person. You just have to pay attention. They walked back to the house together in the dark, not talking. The sky overhead was enormous and clear, the kind of sky you only got this far from town, and the grass smelled like cold starting to come. At the porch, Beatrice stopped. The south field grazing is going to matter by October, she said, if the fence holds. It'll hold, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Good night, Mr. Cross. Good night. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a little longer, looking at the pasture where the roan was a dark shape near the trough. He thought about the ledger numbers. He thought about the fence. He thought about Beatrice Hollow's hands working in the dark to save an animal she'd known for 3 weeks. He didn't try to name what he was feeling. He just let it sit there, the way you let a sore muscle rest instead of pressing on it. Some things needed time before they became clear. By the end of the first month, the ranch looked different. Not dramatically. The barn was still old, the house still showed its years, and the cattle were still rebuilding toward a number that would feel comfortable. But the sheds were organized, the fences repaired, the supply costs reduced, and the garden expanded to a size that would actually contribute something before winter. Gideon started waking up without the particular weight that had been sitting on his chest for the better part of 2 years. He noticed this without celebrating it, because celebrating it felt like pressing your luck. Beatrice had established a routine that started before he was usually awake and ended after he'd already stopped for the evening. She ate at the table while working through her ledger, answered his questions when he had them, asked her own when she needed to, and generally moved through the property with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided what needed to be done and was doing it. She was not cheerful in the way people meant when they called someone cheerful. She laughed occasionally at things that caught her off guard, and those moments were always more genuine than anything performed. She didn't perform much of anything, which Gideon found he appreciated enormously. Other men in the valley found it unsettling. Jake Marrow, who ran the smaller spread about 4 miles east, stopped Gideon at the feed store in Cartwell one afternoon and asked, in the tone of a man providing a genuine service, whether Gideon had considered what people were saying. "About what?" Gideon asked. "About the arrangement." Jake said it carefully. "A woman like that running things. People are going to talk about whether she can actually manage frontier work, the physical side of it." Gideon picked up the sack of grain he'd come for. "She saved one of my cows last week with her hands at midnight," he said. "What are your people talking about while their cows are dying?" Jake didn't have an answer for that either. The feed store proprietor, who had heard all of it, said nothing but caught Gideon's eye on the way out with an expression that was approximately supportive. Gideon drove home thinking about the way people assigned worth so confidently to things they hadn't tested. The cattle were healthy, the fences were up, the ledger was moving in a direction he hadn't seen in 2 years. That was the test that mattered, and Beatrice Hollow was passing it so thoroughly that the people who'd been certain she wouldn't were now having to discuss the terms of their certainty very carefully. He got home to find her in the barn, examining the condition of the hay supply with methodical attention. "We're going to need more before November," she said when she heard him come in. "But if we buy in October, the price is better. I want to talk to Harmon about a forward purchase agreement." "A what?" "We commit to a volume now. They hold the October pricing for us. We take delivery in stages through November and December." She turned around. "It's common in larger operations. Harmon might push back, but I think he'll agree." Gideon set down the grain. "You know," he said, "when you respond to that notice, I was expecting someone who could help with the bookkeeping and maybe the garden." She looked at him. "And you've reorganized the supply chain, and I think you might be renegotiating contracts better than I could." "Probably," she said, without particular ego. "Do you object?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to figure out why you're doing it." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Because it needs doing," she said. "And I'm here," she paused. "And because this place has good bones. Anyone who looked at it without assuming it was finished could see that." He stood there in the barn doorway looking at her, and the afternoon light was doing something particular, and for a moment the whole conversation felt like it was actually about something else entirely, though neither of them moved toward that. "October," he said finally. "Talk to Harmon." "I will," she said, and went back to the hay. The first letter arrived on a Thursday. Beatrice picked up the mail herself that morning. She'd started taking the weekly supply runs because she was also doing business in Cartwell, and it was more efficient. Gideon noticed that morning she came back from town quieter than usual. Not upset exactly, but with the particular quality of stillness that comes from having received news you'd been half expecting and hadn't quite prepared yourself for. He didn't ask. That was a line he'd come to understand in the weeks they'd been working together. There were things she'd tell him when she was ready, and things she wouldn't tell him at all, and the difference between those categories wasn't always obvious until she made it clear. She made dinner. They went over the week's supply accounting. She corrected a small error in his cattle count from the morning. He'd missed 2 in the far corner of the south field, and then she went to her room early. He found the letter in the kitchen trash the next morning. He didn't read it. He didn't even pull it out of the trash. He just saw the handwriting on the envelope. Heavy, deliberate strokes, the kind produced by someone who believed their penmanship communicated authority, and put it back. He went about his morning. But the thing about small ranches is that secrets don't have much room to breathe. And over the next 2 weeks, 2 more letters arrived. And each time they did, Beatrice came back from town with that particular stillness about her. And each time the letter ended up in the trash or the stove. On a Friday evening in early October, with the temperature dropping and the first serious threat of frost in the air, Gideon was at the kitchen table going over the hay purchase agreement when Beatrice sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. He looked up. "There's something I should tell you," she said. He set down the pen. She told him about Roland Mercer, not all at once and not easily. She was a precise woman, and this was imprecise territory, the kind of history that resisted clean accounting. She told it in the flat, factual way she told most things, but there were places where the flatness held something underneath it, something old and tired and still present. Roland Mercer was a ranch owner out of Caldwell County, 50 miles east. He had money, land, and the particular confidence of a man who had never had either seriously challenged. He had decided, several years ago, that Beatrice should marry him. Not because he wanted to, she said. He was very clear about that. He wanted me to understand that he was doing me a favor, that a woman with my, she paused, the smallest pause, appearance had limited prospects, and that he was generous enough to overlook that. Gideon said nothing. "I declined," she said. "Twice." The third time he stopped asking and started telling. "When I left Harlan County, I left because staying had become," she looked at the table, "uncomfortable." "He found you," Gideon said. "It appears so." She looked up. "The letters have been asking me to come back. The most recent one was less polite about it." "What did it say?" She was quiet for a moment. "That I was making a fool of myself, and that when I'd finally come to my senses, he might still be inclined to be understanding about it." Gideon looked at her across the table. The lantern light was low and warm, and the barn was quiet outside, and the temperature had dropped enough that the cold was pressing against the windows. "He's coming," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Beatrice looked at him steadily. "Probably," she said. "Men like Roland Mercer don't stop at letters." "What do you need from me?" She looked slightly surprised, like she'd been prepared for a different kind of question. "I don't need anything," she said carefully. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know that there may be an unpleasant man arriving at your property. That's your business to be informed of. And if I want it to be my business for other reasons?" She looked at him for a long moment. "That depends," she said, "on what those reasons are." He thought about that. He thought about the fence line and the roan in the dark and the hay purchase agreement and $12 in feedback credit and the particular quality of her voice when she was talking through a problem. "I asked for someone strong enough to save this ranch," he said. "You've done that. The rest of it seems like it ought to go both ways." Beatrice Hollow looked at him across the kitchen table for a long, assessing moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the ledger. "Let's finish the hay agreement," she said. But something in the room was different than it had been when they sat down. And that night, lying in his room listening to the wind shift direction and the temperature drop toward frost, Gideon Cross thought about what was coming with something that surprised him when he recognized it. He wasn't afraid of Roland Mercer. He was angry at him. And there was something clarifying about that. Like the moment a fence post finally seated properly in the ground after you'd been fighting the soil. The click of a thing settling into where it belonged. He stared at the ceiling and let the anger sit there, clean and honest, and thought about what he was going to say when that man rode up the road. He thought about it for a long time before he slept. The frost came overnight, the way the first real cold always did out here. Not gradually, not with warning, just a hard fact you woke up to. Gideon found it on the grass when he went out before dawn, a thin white coat over everything, and stood there for a moment with his coffee, letting the cold settle into his face while he thought about the conversation from the night before. He hadn't slept well. Not badly either, just with the restless surface quality of a man whose mind was working on something it hadn't finished. Inside, he could hear Beatrice already moving around the kitchen, the sound of the cast iron pan on the stove. The particular rhythm of her moving through a morning that she'd established in the weeks since arriving. A rhythm so consistent that he'd stopped noticing it consciously and had started relying on it the way you relied on a fence being where you'd put it. He went back inside. She had eggs going and was looking at her ledger at the same time, which was something she did in the mornings when a problem was working itself through her head. She didn't look up when he came in. "The hay purchase agreement needs one more clause," she said. "If Harmon can't fulfill the November delivery within a 10-day window, the price reverts to the current rate. I should have put that in yesterday." "All right. I'll add it this morning before I send it." He poured his coffee and sat down. The eggs were almost ready. She closed the ledger and moved the pan off the heat with the efficient, slightly distracted motion of someone whose mind was still mostly somewhere else. She set a plate in front of him and sat down with her own. They ate without speaking for a while, which was normal. Their mornings had always been comfortable in that way. Neither of them needed conversation before the day had properly started. It was Beatrice who broke it. "I want to be clear about something," she said, without preamble. He looked at her. "Roland Mercer is my problem," she said. "I told you about him because you had a right to know, not because I'm asking you to manage it." "I didn't say you were." "You implied it." Gideon set down his fork. "I said it ought to go both ways. That's not the same as saying I'll handle it for you." She looked at him for a moment with that measuring expression she had, the one that was more thorough than people expected when they first encountered it. "Fair enough," she said, and picked up her fork again. But the conversation wasn't quite finished, and they both knew it. "Has he ever done anything beyond letters?" Gideon asked. "He showed up twice in Harlan County," she said. "Once at the dry goods store where I worked. Once at my boarding house." She paused. "He was polite both times. That's almost worse." "Polite how?" "The kind of polite that's really just control wearing a nicer coat." She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table. He'd explained very reasonably why I was making a mistake, why my situation was more limited than I seemed to understand, why he was being generous, even bothering. Gideon thought about that. "And what did you say?" "The first time I tried to explain myself." She said it flatly, without self-pity. "The second time I didn't. There's nothing to explain to someone who's already decided what you are." He looked at her across the table. The morning light was coming in through the east window and catching the side of her face, and she looked like someone who had made peace with a very particular kind of exhaustion. "When he comes," Gideon said, "he'll be on my property." She met his eyes. "That means I have a say in what happens," he said. "Not instead of you, alongside." A pause. "Alongside," she repeated, like she was testing the weight of the word. "That's what I said." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, and went back to her breakfast. Outside, the frost was already starting to burn off in the early sun. By mid-morning it would be gone, and the day would be deceptively warm, the way October days sometimes were before winter stopped pretending. The community of Harrow Valley, if a collection of scattered properties and one main road through Cartwell could be called a community, operated on information the way a dry field operated on rain. Everything got absorbed immediately and spread in every direction. By the second week of October, people knew three things about the Cross Ranch with varying degrees of accuracy: that the new woman was running the operation with unusual competence, that she was not what anyone had expected, and that there was a man from Caldwell County who had been writing her letters. The third detail had come from the post office, which was operated by a woman named Maren Hobbs, who didn't intend to spread information but absorbed it incidentally and distributed it in the same way, without particular intention. It was through Maren that Gideon first heard the name Roland Mercer spoken by someone other than Beatrice. He was in Cartwell picking up wire for a fence repair, a different section this time, the western edge where two posts had gone soft with rot. When Maren appeared in the doorway of the post office and beckoned him over with the particular energy of someone who had information they felt responsible for delivering. "A man came through yesterday," she said, keeping her voice down despite the fact that the street was mostly empty. "Asking about directions to your property. Rode a good horse, dressed well." She gave him a look. "He didn't leave his name, but I heard him mention Miss Hollows to someone at the dry goods." Gideon kept his expression level. "What did you tell him?" "About directions? Nothing useful." Maren straightened up. "I told him the road east of here was unreliable after rain, and he'd do better to ask in Dunbar." She paused. "I don't know if he believed me." "Probably bought you a day," Gideon said. "Probably." She folded her arms. That woman of yours renegotiated half the supply contracts in Cartwell, and the merchant accounts are all better off for it. And if someone's come to drag her back somewhere she left on purpose, I thought you ought to know ahead of time." He looked at her. "She's not mine," he said. Marin Hobbs looked back at him with the direct patience of someone who had run a post office for 20 years and had consequently heard a great many things people said that they didn't entirely mean. "Well," she said, "all the same." He drove home with the wire in the wagon bed and the information sitting heavy in his chest, and thought about what Beatrice had said that morning, alongside. He'd meant it when he said it, but he was starting to understand that alongside was going to require something more concrete than intent. He got home an hour before dark to find Beatrice in the south field, checking on the late garden beds with the focused attention of someone cataloging what still had time to produce before the hard frost. He told her what Marin had said. She didn't react the way he'd half expected. She didn't go still or pale. She just looked at the garden bed for a moment and then said, "So today or tomorrow?" "Most likely." She stood up from where she'd been crouching, brushed the soil from her hands, looked at the western sky where the light was going orange. "I need to finish checking these beds," she said. He stood there watching her work for a moment. "Beatrice." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, the kind that sounds simple and isn't. She held his gaze for a moment before answering. "I'm not afraid of him," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I left because staying had become untenable, not because I was running from fear." "I know. But," she turned back to the garden, "there's a particular kind of tired that comes from being told, very confidently, by someone who has never met you, exactly what you are and what you're worth." She pulled a withered bean plant from the soil and set it aside. "And I've been tired that way for a long time. I'd like to not be anymore." He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have improved on what she'd just said. He went to fix the western fence before the light failed. Roland Mercer arrived the following morning. He came up the road just after 9, riding a well-maintained gray horse with the unhurried pace of someone who wasn't expecting opposition. He was about 50, Gideon guessed, with the broad build of a man who'd once done physical work and had since converted to the kind of authority that didn't require it. Good coat, good boots, everything about him signaling wealth with the practiced ease of a man who understood that presentation was its own argument. Gideon was near the barn when he rode in. He set down the water bucket he'd been carrying and stood with his arms at his sides and watched the man dismount. Mercer looked at the property with the assessing gaze of someone adding up what things were worth. His eyes moved over the repaired fences, the organized yard, the expanded garden beds, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough, to suggest he'd expected something more dilapidated. "Looking for Gideon Cross," he said. "You found him." Mercer turned toward him fully. He had the handshake posture, the extended hand, the direct approach, of a man who understood social currency. Gideon didn't move toward him. A small calculation passed behind Mercer's eyes. "Roland Mercer," he said, "out of Caldwell County. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." "You mean Beatrice Hollow?" "That's right." Mercer looked around the yard again. "Is she here?" "This is her working day," Gideon said, "same as any other." "Well," Mercer smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind calibrated to seem reasonable while leaving room for authority. "I won't keep her long. We have some business to settle." "What kind of business?" Mercer looked at him with the slight impatience of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned by the people in front of them. "The personal kind," he said, "if you don't mind." "She works here," Gideon said. "On my property. If there's something needs settling on my property, that's not entirely personal." The smile stayed in place but changed quality slightly, became thinner. "I see," Mercer said. "She's been telling you things, I imagine." "She told me you've been sending letters." "Correspondence between people who know each other well," Mercer said easily. "Nothing unusual about that." "Depends on the correspondence." Mercer studied him for a moment. Gideon could feel the assessment. The man was deciding what he was dealing with, categorizing, placing. He had the look of someone who was very accustomed to being the most important person in a given situation and was mildly inconvenienced to find that this was not automatically that situation. "I'd like to speak with her," Mercer said. Final and pleasant, the tone of someone repeating a reasonable request to someone who hadn't understood it correctly the first time. "That's up to her," Gideon said. At which point Beatrice came around the corner of the house. She had been inside. Gideon didn't know if she'd seen Mercer arrive or if the timing was coincidence, though with Beatrice he'd learned that coincidence was rarely the explanation. She walked toward them at her normal pace, her expression exactly as unreadable as it always was when she was managing something. Mercer turned when he heard her footsteps. "Beatrice," he said, and his voice shifted into something warmer, a register of familiarity that was performing a relationship rather than reflecting one. "You're looking well." She stopped about 8 feet from him. "Roland?" "I've been writing," he said. "I know." "You haven't replied." "I know that too." The pleasant warmth in his expression held, but barely. "We should talk," he said, "privately." "Gideon stays," she said. Mercer glanced at Gideon with the brief, tolerant look of a man acknowledging an inconvenience. "This is a personal matter, Beatrice." "Then you won't mind if Gideon hears it," she said, "since it's personal and there's nothing in it that ought to embarrass anyone." Mercer looked at her steadily. Something was shifting in his bearing, very slightly. The pleasantness was recalibrating. "You left without a word," he said, "after everything I offered you." "I left after declining your offer twice and asking you to stop," she said. "I consider that adequate communication." "You were being foolish." He said it with the gentleness of a man delivering a difficult truth. "Running off to manage some struggling homestead in the middle of nowhere. You're a capable woman, Beatrice. You don't need to be doing this." "I'm doing exactly what I should be doing," she said, "and it's not your assessment to make." Mercer's jaw tightened, just slightly. He looked around the yard again, the deliberate, appraising look of someone who wants you to watch him evaluate what you have and find it insufficient. "The man's ranch was failing," he said. "The whole valley knows it. You've come here to work yourself to the bone for someone else's future." "The ranch isn't failing anymore," she said. A beat of silence. Mercer looked at Gideon, then back at Beatrice. "Beatrice, be reasonable. You know what people say. You know how they look at you." He spread his hands in the gesture of generous honesty. "I'm not saying that's right or fair, but it's the reality you live in, and I'm offering you a situation that what?" she said. "That gives you security, standing, something respectable." The ranch yard was very quiet. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the cattle shifted and settled. "You've never once asked me what I wanted," Beatrice said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "In every conversation we've ever had about my life, you've told me what I have, what I lack, what I should take, and what I should be grateful for. And you have never once asked what I wanted." Mercer looked at her. "So I'll tell you now," she said. "I want to be somewhere I'm useful. I want to do work that matters. I want to be in a place where someone looks at what I've done and sees the work, not the person doing it." She paused. "I have all of that here." "You have a temporary arrangement," Mercer said, and his voice had lost some of its warmth now. "A working situation that could end tomorrow. You're not a partner here. You're an employee." "We can address that," Gideon said. Both of them looked at him. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out with the flat certainty of something he'd been moving toward without fully realizing it. "The arrangement's been informal," he said, looking at Beatrice, not Mercer. "That can change." Beatrice held his gaze for a moment. Mercer made a small sound that was approximately a laugh. "You're offering her a partnership," he said. "Out of what? Gratitude? Because she's organized your supply sheds?" "Because she saved this ranch," Gideon said. "And because the kind of person who does that deserves the thing they've helped build." Mercer looked between them. The pleasant, reasonable expression had gone now, replaced with something colder and more honest. "She'll leave," he said to Gideon. "When the season gets hard, when the real difficulty comes, She didn't leave when the cow went down at midnight," Gideon said. "She didn't leave when the frost came early. She didn't leave when your letters arrived." He looked at Mercer directly. "She's still here." The silence after that was not comfortable. Mercer stood in the yard with his horse behind him and the repaired fence visible over his shoulder and the organized, functional evidence of Beatrice's work arranged around him in every direction he looked. He was a man who had come expecting to retrieve something, and the thing he'd expected to retrieve had become something he hadn't accounted for. "Beatrice," he said, and there was an edge in it now that hadn't been there before, the edge of someone who has run out of gentle options. "You're making yourself look foolish." "No," she said simply. "I don't think I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the property one more time, not with assessment now, but with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd been confident about. The repair work on the fences, the garden beds, the organized sheds, the cattle, visible in the south field, healthier than the valley had expected them to be. He said nothing else. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted his horse. "This isn't finished," he said from the saddle, looking down at both of them. "It is," Beatrice said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned the horse and rode back down the road the way he'd come. Gideon and Beatrice stood in the yard and watched him go. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes after Mercer disappeared around the bend in the road. The morning had continued around them while all of it was happening. A crow in the far tree line, the cattle moving in the south field, the particular light of mid-October sitting over everything with its particular quality of clarity and warning. The world hadn't paused for any of it, which was both reassuring and slightly disorienting. Beatrice turned first, went to the garden beds they'd been examining the night before, and crouched down to look at the turnip progress the way she had been doing before everything interrupted. Gideon went and stood near her. "You said we can address that," she said, without looking up from the turnips. "Yes." "Did you mean it?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She was quiet for a moment. "A partnership is a serious thing." "I know what a partnership is." She looked up at him. "I'm not asking because I doubt you. I'm asking because I need to know that it's not something you said to win an argument." He crouched down to her level, which put them at roughly the same eye contact. "I've been thinking about it since before he showed up," he said. "He just moved the timeline." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. "If we formalize this," she said carefully, "it changes things." "It already changed things. I'm just suggesting we acknowledge it in writing." She looked back at the turnips. One corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd seen that day. "You'd need a lawyer," she said, "for a real agreement." "Cartwell has one." "I know. I've already met her, about the hay contract." She looked at him. "Helen Vass, she's competent." Of course she already knew the Cartwell lawyer. He'd stopped being surprised by these things. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "We'll go tomorrow," she said. "It's my name on it, too." "Fair enough." She went back to examining the garden beds with the same steady focus she brought to everything. After a few minutes, she started telling him what she expected the turnip yield to be, and whether the late beans would make it before the next frost, and what she thought about the preserving situation relative to their winter food needs. He listened, crouching there in the cold morning air, and thought about Roland Mercer riding back down the road with his good boots and his well-maintained horse and his certainty about what Beatrice Hollow was and wasn't, and how all of that certainty had ridden out of the yard and hadn't left a mark. The thing about a man like Mercer was that he'd looked at Beatrice and seen the outside of a thing and drawn his conclusions. And those conclusions had seemed so obvious to him, so settled, that he'd never thought to look further. And what he'd missed, what he'd ridden past without even knowing it was there, was the whole interior of a person, the actual substance of her, the ledger mind and the midnight hands, and the way she could walk onto a failing ranch and see what it could be without being distracted by what it was. Gideon had been guilty of something similar when she'd first arrived. He hadn't been cruel about it the way Mercer was, hadn't had the arrogance to say it out loud, but there had been a moment on that first afternoon when he'd felt the vague surprise of finding more than he'd expected. He wasn't proud of that exactly, but he thought being honest about it in his own head was probably the better option. What he was now was sure, and that was different. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular compressed energy of late October, when the season is tightening around everything and the things you haven't done yet announce themselves urgently. They went to Helen Vass together, and the lawyer, a narrow-faced, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who had apparently already heard of Beatrice through the Harmon feed negotiations, drew up a working partnership agreement with the professional efficiency of someone who had handled more complicated matters and found this one refreshingly clear. "You both understand what you're signing," Helen said, setting the documents on the table. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't dismissive either. "Yes," Beatrice said. "The property remains in his name for purposes of existing deed and mortgage," Helen said. "The operating interest and profit structure is as discussed. Any major financial decisions above $50 require both signatures." "Agreed," Gideon said. Helen looked between them. "This is an unusual arrangement," she said. "Most useful arrangements are," Beatrice said. Helen's mouth moved in the way of a woman who found something genuinely interesting. "Sign here," she said. "And here. Both of you." They signed. Riding back in the wagon, Gideon thought about how strange it was that something significant could happen in such an ordinary physical way. Documents on a table, ink, 2 signatures. The world didn't announce it, didn't mark it. The horse moved at the same pace it always moved. The road was the same road, but something had shifted in the way the two of them sat together in the wagon. A slight but real adjustment in the physical quality of the space between them, like two things that had been held at approximate position finally allowed to settle into actual position. Beatrice had her ledger open on her knee. She always seemed to have the ledger, and was making notes about the winter supply situation, but at some point on the road back she stopped writing and just looked at the land going by. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking about what he said, that I was doing this for someone else's future." And she looked at the ledger in her hands, at the numbers that were no longer someone else's problem alone. "It's different now," she said simply. He kept his eyes on the road, but he felt it too, that difference. It was small and large at the same time, the way the most important things often were. "The hay delivery's coming Thursday," she said, opening the ledger again. "I know. We need to get the storage barn cleared by Wednesday. I'll start tomorrow." She made a note. He drove the horse. The valley opened out ahead of them as they came around the last curve before the Cross Ranch Road, and the property was visible from there. The barn, the house, the repaired fence lines, the garden beds in their expanded rows, the cattle visible as dark shapes in the south field. It looked, from this distance, like a place that was working, like a place with intention behind it. Gideon pulled the wagon into the yard and stopped. They both sat there for a moment, looking at it. "It's coming along," Beatrice said finally, with the understated satisfaction of someone who had been working toward a thing and was allowing herself, just briefly, to see it. "Yes," he said. She climbed down from the wagon and went toward the barn to check on the storage situation. He stayed for a moment, watching her go, and then started unhitching the horse. The afternoon was cooling fast, the way it did this time of year, the warmth draining out of the day in the last hour before dark. But the work wasn't done, and there was still enough light, and tomorrow there would be more. That was the thing about a ranch coming back from the edge. It didn't announce its recovery. It just kept asking you to show up day after day, and somewhere in that accumulation, the balance tipped. The balance was tipping. He could feel it. And for the first time in 2 years, that feeling didn't make him nervous. It made him want to keep going, to see what was on the other side of it, to find out what this place could actually become if they kept refusing to let it fail. He led the horse toward the barn and heard Beatrice inside already, assessing the storage situation with the same focused attention she brought to every other problem. "We're going to need to move those crates to the east wall," she called out. "All right," he said, "and that broken plow frame has to go. It's taking up floor space. I'll deal with it. Tonight, ideally." "Tonight," he agreed and stepped into the barn. The hay came Thursday, as arranged, and the delivery was exactly what Beatrice had negotiated. Full volume, October pricing, stacked in the cleared storage barn in 3 orderly rows that would see them through to March if the winter behaved itself, and through to February if it didn't. Harmon himself drove the second wagon, which was unusual. He normally sent a hired hand. Gideon noticed this and said nothing. Beatrice noticed it too. When the unloading was done and the men who'd driven the wagons had been given water and a few minutes' rest, Harmon approached the house with his hat in his hands and the careful bearing of a man conducting a visit he'd thought about in advance. "Miss Hollow," he said when Beatrice came to the door. "It's the partnership documents that have you here," she said. Not unkindly, just directly. Harmon had the grace to look mildly embarrassed. "Word gets around." "It does," she agreed. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Beatrice had gone through Gideon's ledger on the first afternoon, where the hay agreement had been worked through, where Roland Mercer's visit had been discussed the night before it happened. The table had become a kind of working center of gravity for the ranch, and Gideon thought sometimes that if it could have absorbed and retained everything discussed on its surface, it would have told the whole story of the past 2 months in grain and ink stains. Harmon had a proposal. He'd been thinking, he said, about expanding his supply arrangement with the Cross Ranch on a longer-term basis. A 2-year agreement, guaranteed volumes, consistent pricing with a fixed annual adjustment. Beatrice listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was finished, she opened her ledger. "The pricing structure you're proposing has the annual adjustment tied to your costs," she said. "I'd want it tied to a regional average." Harmon blinked. "That's not standard." "It protects both sides," she said. "If your costs go up and the regional average doesn't, you're not penalized. If the regional average goes up and your costs don't, we're not either. It's cleaner." Harmon looked at Gideon as if expecting some kind of arbitration. Gideon lifted his coffee cup. "She speaks for the ranch," he said. "Both of us." Harmon turned back to Beatrice. They spent 40 minutes on the details. By the end of it, they had the outline of an agreement that Beatrice would take back to Helen Vass for documentation. And Harmon left with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had come expecting a conversation and received a negotiation. At the door, he paused. "You know," he said, to no one in particular, "when Cross first started ranching here, I didn't think he'd last 3 seasons. He looked at Beatrice. "I don't say that to be cruel, the place had a reputation." "Most places do," Beatrice said. "It's different now," he said. "Whatever you've done here, it's different." He put his hat back on and went to his wagon. Beatrice closed the door and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch, looking at nothing in particular. "He meant it as a compliment," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "I'm trying to decide how I feel about compliments that start with admissions of low expectations." He thought about that. "I think you take them and file them," he said, "and then you beat the expectations so thoroughly that eventually people stop mentioning what they were." She looked at him. "That's the plan," he said. She went back to the ledger with what he was almost certain was a suppressed smile. November arrived as though it had been waiting impatiently just outside the valley and had finally run out of patience. The temperature didn't drop gradually. It dropped like something falling. 3 days of sharp, serious cold that drove the cattle together in the north field and turned the ground into a surface that rang when you stepped on it. Gideon woke up the first morning of it to ice in the water bucket near the barn and spent the early hours breaking it with a hatchet handle while his breath came out in solid white bursts. Beatrice was already in the storage barn when he got there, checking on the hay supply. "We're fine on feed," she said. Her voice was slightly muffled by the wool wrap she'd tied around her neck and lower face. "But the water situation is going to be daily work now." "I know. The south trough is worst. It's in the shade most of the morning. I'll rig a cover for it today." She made a note. He could see her breath too, short even puffs of steam above the wrap. She had a practical approach to cold that he'd come to recognize. She didn't complain about it, didn't adjust her pace for it, just added the cold to the list of things that needed accounting for, and moved on. He built the trough cover from scrap lumber he'd been saving near the barn. It wasn't elegant. A slanted board roof on 4 short posts, angled to catch what morning sun reached that corner of the south field. But it cut the freeze time on the trough by a couple of hours each morning, which was a couple of hours of work saved, which added up over a winter that was evidently planning to be serious about itself. The cattle were another matter. 3 of the older animals, including the roan Beatrice had saved in September, had developed a rough cough that might have been nothing and might have been the early sign of something that could move through a herd with the casual devastation of fire through dry grass. Gideon found them on the 3rd morning of the cold snap and went straight to find Beatrice. She came out to the field immediately, pulling on her coat as she walked. She examined all three animals with the same methodical attention she brought to the supply ledger, working around each one, checking eyes and nostrils and breathing patterns, running her hands along their flanks to feel for heat. "It's not serious yet," she said, standing back. "But it will be if the temperature drops again before they've built any resistance." "What do we do?" "Separate them from the main herd tonight. Keep them warmer. I have some dried herbs I brought from Harlan County for exactly this kind of thing. Combined with clean water and better shelter, they should come through it." Gideon looked at her. "Herbs?" "My mother's practice," she said, without defensiveness. "Practical. Tested. If you'd prefer to wait for the veterinarian from Dunbar, you can. But he charges $3 a visit and won't get here until the day after tomorrow." "Herbs," he said again, but this time without the skeptical inflection. She set up a section of the barn for the three animals that afternoon. Gideon moved the feed and the water, laid extra straw, worked on the gaps in the barn wall where the cold was getting through. Beatrice prepared whatever she'd brought from Harlan County and administered it with the steady-handed competence that he'd stopped questioning sometime around the third week of October. That night, they checked on the animals together at 9 o'clock and again at midnight. The roan, which had apparently decided that Beatrice was either responsible for its continued existence or constituted some form of reassuring presence, watched her with large, quiet eyes every time she came within its radius. "She remembers you," Gideon said, standing at the gate of the pen. "Animals remember the hands that helped them," Beatrice said. "It's not sentiment. It's survival logic." "Could be both." She looked at the roan for a moment. "Could be," she agreed. They walked back to the house at midnight under a sky so clear and cold it looked polished. The stars were the hard white kind you only got in genuine winter. No warmth to them at all, just light. At the porch, they stopped in the way they'd developed a habit of stopping. Neither of them rushing to go in, both of them standing in the cold dark for a moment before the day fully ended. "They'll be all right," she said. About the cattle, he understood. About the winter. About something larger than either, possibly. "Yes," he said. She went inside. He stayed a moment longer, looking at the south field where the trough cover was a dark shape in the starlight, and thought about how strange it was that the things most worth holding on to looked so ordinary when you were actually holding them. Word reached them about Roland Mercer on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into November, through a source neither of them expected. Porter Wills came to the door himself, which was unusual enough that Gideon felt the particular alertness of something being out of pattern before Porter even opened his mouth. He came in, accepted coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the manner of a man delivering information he wasn't entirely comfortable having. Delia had heard it from someone in Cartwell, who had heard it from a man passing through from Caldwell County. Roland Mercer had been telling people in Caldwell County that the Cross Ranch arrangement was temporary, that Beatrice was there under a kind of misunderstanding about her own prospects, that she would return when she'd worked it out of her system. "He's been saying it widely," Porter said. He had the grace to look at Beatrice when he said it. "To people with ranching interests out east, the kind of people who talk to other people with ranching interests." Beatrice held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table. "Is he suggesting the partnership agreement isn't real?" she asked. "He's suggesting it's," Porter chose his word carefully, "informal. Sentimental," he called it. Said Cross felt sorry for a woman with no real options and offered her something that would be renegotiated when the season proved difficult. The kitchen was quiet. Gideon felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite anger, more like the feeling of a clean thing being handled with dirty hands. "He's talking to suppliers," Beatrice said. It wasn't a question. She'd gotten there faster than Porter had. "Possibly," Porter said. "He's trying to undercut the supply agreements," she said. "If he can convince Harmon or the others that this arrangement is temporary and we're not stable partners, they'll stop offering us favorable terms." Porter looked at her with the expression of a man who had just seen something move faster than he expected. "That's my guess, too," he said. Gideon put his cup down. "He didn't get what he came for in person," he said. "So now he's working the edges." "He has money and connections in Caldwell County," Beatrice said evenly. "He can make phone calls and pay visits and plant doubts. It costs him very little." "What does it cost us?" Gideon asked. She looked at him steadily. "Potentially quite a lot," she said, "if we let it." Porter finished his coffee and left them with it, which was the right thing to do. He stopped at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "Delia changed her mind about things. She told me to say so." He looked at Beatrice specifically. She was wrong about what she said in the garden. She knows that. After he left, Gideon and Beatrice sat with the problem the way they sat with most problems, at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and the cold pressing at the windows. "He can't undo the Helen Vass agreement," Gideon said. "That's documented and filed." "He's not trying to undo it legally," Beatrice said. "He's trying to make people doubt it practically. Different problem." She opened the ledger. "The Harmon agreement isn't finalized yet. That's the most vulnerable point. So we finalize it faster. Tomorrow if Helen Vass has the time." She made a note. "The other issue is that he's probably not limiting himself to supply relationships. If he's talking to ranching interests in Caldwell County, he may be talking to land buyers or lenders." Gideon looked at her. "Why land buyers?" "Because our expansion east of the fence line has been public discussion. If he can persuade a buyer to approach the bank about that parcel before we can, and if the bank gets the impression that the Cross Ranch's financial footing is uncertain," she paused. "He doesn't have to do anything directly. He just has to create enough doubt that other people's decisions work against us." The precision of it was almost impressive and deeply infuriating. "He could have just ridden away," Gideon said. "Men like Roland Mercer don't ride away," she said. "They reposition." She said it without particular emotion, with the flat accuracy of someone who had studied a subject longer than they'd wanted to. "What do we need?" he asked. She looked at the ledger, then she looked up at him. "We need Helen Vass tomorrow. We need the Harmon agreement signed. We need to write to the bank directly, ahead of any approach from Caldwell County, and confirm the status of our financial position in writing." She paused. "And we need to talk to the other ranchers." Porter was already here. "Porter's one. McCready is important. He has connections east and west. And Marin Hobbs knows more about what moves through this valley than anyone in it." He thought about this. "You want to get ahead of the story." "The story is already moving," she said. "We need to move faster." It was nearly 10 o'clock. The cattle in the barn were settled. The cold was solid and deep outside. By any reasonable measure, it was time to stop thinking about Roland Mercer and get some rest. Instead, Beatrice turned to a fresh page in the ledger and began making a list of every professional relationship the ranch had, in order of priority and vulnerability. Gideon got up and poured more coffee. It was going to be a long evening. The next 2 weeks were the most deliberately social period Gideon Cross had experienced since before his wife had passed, which was not something he reflected on directly, but which sat somewhere at the back of his awareness as he and Beatrice moved through a series of conversations, visits, and carefully worded letters that amounted to a campaign to tell their own story before Roland Mercer could tell it for them. Helen Vass finalized the Harmon agreement in 2 days. Gideon and Beatrice signed it on a Thursday morning, and Harmon, who had apparently already heard the Mercer version of events through his own channels, signed it that same afternoon with the decisive manner of a man choosing a side after careful consideration. "I supply good ranches," Harmon said, putting his pen down. "This is a good ranch." It was simple, and it was enough. The letter to the bank went out the same day as the Harmon signing. Beatrice wrote it, and it was one of the more precisely constructed documents Gideon had read. Not defensive, not urgent, just a clear accounting of the ranch's current position, the signed partnership documentation, and the supply agreements already in place. It presented the Cross Ranch as exactly what it had become: a recovering operation with documented improvements, a stable financial direction, and 2 people whose names were on every relevant piece of paper. McCready was the more delicate conversation. He was a larger operation, McCready, spread over 500 acres to the northeast, and he had the particular authority of a man who had been ranching successfully for 30 years and whose opinion carried weight in any discussion of valley business. He was not a bad man, Gideon knew, but he was a careful one, and careful men were susceptible to doubt in specific ways. They drove to McCready's on a Tuesday morning, Gideon and Beatrice together in the wagon. McCready met them in his yard. He was a short, broad man with a white beard he kept neatly trimmed and the quiet watchfulness of someone who had spent decades reading weather and livestock and wasn't much worse at reading people. He looked at Beatrice directly when they introduced themselves, which Gideon noted as its own kind of statement. "I've heard about the cross operation," McCready said. "Most of it recently and from Caldwell County." "Most of it recently and from Caldwell County would be Roland Mercer's version," Beatrice said. McCready looked at her. "And you're here to give me the other version." "I'm here to give you the accurate version," she said, "which you can verify through Harmon, through Helen Vass, and through the ranch's bank records if you request them through normal channels." She paused. "We're not asking you to take our word for it. We're asking you to get the information before you form an opinion based on someone else's." McCready was quiet for a moment. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line behind his barn. "Mercer came through here last week," McCready said. Neither of them reacted outwardly. "Sat right where you're sitting," McCready continued. "Very well-dressed man, very reasonable. Said he was concerned about a woman who'd gotten herself into a situation she didn't fully understand. Said the cross arrangement was," he paused, "charity wearing the clothes of a business partnership." The silence was specific and cold. "And?" Beatrice said. McCready looked at her steadily. "And I told him I don't generally form opinions about other people's business dealings based on the testimony of a man with an obvious personal interest." He looked at Gideon. "But I told him I'd wait to see what the people involved had to say about it." Gideon exhaled slowly. "The operation is what it is," Beatrice said. "The documents are public record. The improvements are visible to anyone who rides past the property." She met McCready's eyes. "I'm not asking you to like me or to vouch for me. I'm asking you to not let someone else's story fill the space before the facts do." McCready looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of man who didn't speak until he'd finished thinking, and he took his time with it. "My wife," he said finally, "ran this operation for 4 years after my first serious illness. Made every major decision, kept us solvent." He looked at his hands for a moment. "There are people in this valley who still think I run it alone." He looked back up at Beatrice. "I know what it looks like when someone's doing the work and not getting the accounting." The space between them held something quiet and significant. "You've got the accounting now?" he asked. "In writing," she said, "filed with Helen Vass." He nodded once. "Then Mercer's got nothing," he said simply. "A man can say what he likes about a situation that the paperwork contradicts. Eventually, people check the paper." They drove home in the early afternoon, the wagon moving through a landscape that was gray-brown and dormant under the November sky, the kind of quiet that a cold month lays over everything, and that can feel like loss if you let it, or like waiting if you look at it differently. "McCready's wife," Gideon said after a while. "I know," Beatrice said. "You didn't know he was going to say that." "No." She was looking at the road. "But I knew there had to be something. Men like McCready who've been doing this that long. They've seen something real. Otherwise, they wouldn't be that careful." He thought about that. "Is that how you read people?" "I try to figure out what they actually know," she said, "not what they say they know. People who've been through hard things know different things than people who've only heard about them." He drove for a while. "What do you know?" he asked. "From what you've been through." She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "I know that people's first assessment of you is mostly about them," she said finally. "What they're afraid of, what they need to believe, what they've decided the world looks like." She watched the tree line go past, and I know that you can spend a lot of energy trying to change that first assessment, or you can just keep doing the work and let the second assessment catch up eventually. "And the second assessment? Takes longer," she said, "but it's more likely to be based on something real." He thought about McCready, who had waited to hear both sides. He thought about Harmon, who had driven the second wagon himself. He thought about Porter Wills appearing at the door with a message from his wife. "It's catching up," he said. She looked at him, and this time she let the almost smile become an actual one. Brief, real, the kind she couldn't produce on purpose, only let happen. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." The letter from the bank arrived the following week. It was addressed to both of them, which was the first time Gideon had seen his and Beatrice's names on an official document delivered by external party, and the small, specific reality of it, the two names on the envelope in the bank clerk's tidy script, did something to him that he didn't immediately have words for. The letter confirmed the bank's familiarity with the partnership documentation and expressed confidence in the operation's current trajectory. There was a sentence near the end that Beatrice read aloud, once, and then set the letter down. They referenced the improved cattle count and the supply agreements, she said. They got the information from Harmon's account of the long-term agreement. Mercer's already been to the bank, Gideon said. Before our letter, she said, but after the Harmon signing. She looked at the letter again. He was too late. The documentation was already in place. Gideon looked at the envelope on the table. Both names. He went to a lot of trouble, he said. He did, she agreed. People often do when they're more committed to an idea than to the truth of a situation. The idea being that you'd come back. The idea being that I was what he decided I was. She picked up her pen. Those aren't quite the same thing. He sat with that. Outside, the wind had shifted from the northwest, which meant another cold front was coming. He could feel it in the specific way the air pressure changed before weather moved in. Something his body had learned to read the way you learned to read anything you paid enough attention to. He looked at Beatrice across the table, at the pen moving steadily across the ledger page. He's not going to stop, Gideon said. She didn't look up. No, she said. Probably not. So what do we do with that? She stopped writing. She set the pen down and looked at him with the direct, unhurried gaze that was one of the most distinctive things about her. The gaze that meant she was actually going to answer the question rather than deflect it. We keep building, she said. Every agreement we sign, every season we get through, every account we maintain, that's one more thing that exists regardless of what Roland Mercer tells people. She picked up the pen again. A man like that runs on the gap between what people know and what they assume. We close the gap. It was the most straightforwardly determined thing she had ever said, delivered in the same even voice she used for feed counts and frost predictions. Gideon looked at her and thought about what Roland Mercer had seen when he'd ridden into this yard. A heavy woman in a plain dress, working someone else's failing ranch. A situation his certainties had already explained before he'd arrived. And what was actually here. The ledger pages dense with careful numbers. The storage barn full of properly priced hay. The signed agreements and the bank letter and the roan that was healthy because of hands that had worked in the dark to make it so. The gap between those two things, between what Mercer had assumed and what actually existed, was every month of work that had happened since September. It would keep growing. And Roland Mercer, riding around Caldwell County with his polished boots and his story about a woman with no real options, was going to keep finding that the gap was bigger than he remembered, and the ground he thought he was standing on was further from the truth than it had been the last time he'd checked. Gideon picked up his own pen. "What's the cattle count at this week?" he asked. Beatrice turned a page in the ledger. 49, she said, and the roan's putting weight back on. Good, he said. They worked until the wind picked up and the lamp needed trimming, and outside the temperature dropped toward something serious, and the ranch settled into the cold with the particular solidity of a thing that had been properly built and intended to stay. The cold front that Gideon had felt coming in the shift of the northwest wind arrived 2 days later and meant business. It wasn't the worst blizzard the valley had seen. Old-timers in Cartwell had stories about winters in the previous decade that made this one sound mild. But it was serious enough to matter, which was the only kind of serious that counted when you had livestock and open fencing and a barn with gaps that the wind found with cheerful efficiency. 3 days of heavy snow. Then a thaw that lasted exactly long enough to give everyone false hope. Then another freeze that turned the thaw water into a glaze of ice over everything. The fence posts, the trough covers, the barn steps, the south field where the cattle stood looking at the frozen ground, with the patient resignation of animals that had been through this before and knew there was no use in having opinions about it. Gideon broke ice every morning, starting before light. His hands ached by mid-morning in a way that settled into the joints and stayed there, the specific complaint of cold work done without adequate rest. He didn't mention it to Beatrice, who was running on the same insufficient sleep and probably had the same aching hands and hadn't mentioned it either. They had developed, over the months, an efficient and slightly unspoken system for not making their own difficulties into problems that required management. It wasn't suppression exactly, more like the practical understanding that the work didn't pause for complaint, and that complaining about cold to someone who was also cold was a use of energy that neither of them could currently afford. But the system had its limits. On the fifth morning of the second freeze, Gideon came in from the barn at 7 and found Beatrice sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on, and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and her face carrying the particular quality of someone who has been awake longer than they should have been managing something that hadn't gone right. He sat down without speaking. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "The 3 animals we separated in November," she said. "The younger one. The heifer." He waited. "She went down around 3 this morning. I was checking them at midnight, and she seemed all right. When I went back at 3, Beatrice paused. "She's struggling." He was on his feet and back into his coat before she'd finished the sentence. The heifer was in the corner of the separated pen, lying with her legs tucked under her and her breathing labored in a way that was different from the roan in September, more urgent, less responsive. She didn't track him when he came in, which was a bad sign. Beatrice came in behind him. "She was showing mild symptoms last week," Beatrice said, crouching beside the animal. "I thought we'd gotten ahead of it." She ran her hands along the heifer's neck and shoulder with the focused attention of someone gathering information. The cold came back too fast, before she'd fully recovered. "What do we need?" "More warmth than this pen is providing. The gap in the northeast wall, the one you patched with the board. It's failing. I can feel it from here." Gideon went straight to the northeast wall. She was right. The board patch had worked loose, probably in the wind of the first blizzard, and the cold was getting through in a thin, steady stream that wasn't dramatic enough to notice unless you were specifically checking. He hammered it back and stuffed the gap with straw from the top layer of the hay supply. It wasn't a permanent fix. Nothing in a hard winter ever was, but it stopped the draft. He brought 2 extra blankets from the house, the kind used for the horses in particularly bad cold, and Beatrice arranged them around the heifer with the economical care of someone who'd done this before and knew that doing it right the first time was better than having to do it again. They stayed with the animal. Not all of it was tense. Some of it was just sitting in a cold barn with a lamp and the sound of wind and the slow, monitored breathing of a sick animal, which had its own particular quality. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, like time was moving differently in that small circle of lamp warmth. At some point around 9 in the morning, Beatrice said, "Tell me something." He looked at her. "Anything," she said. "About before." He thought about that. Before the ranch went bad? Or before the ranch? Either. He leaned back against the pen wall. "I had a wife," he said. "Clara. She died 4 years ago. Fever. It was fast, which people told me was a mercy, and I understand what they meant by it, but fast doesn't make the space she left any smaller." Beatrice said nothing. She was watching the heifer. "She was the one who wanted this place," he said. "Found the listing, talked me into it, said the valley was the right size, said the land had good bones." He heard himself use her words without intending to. "I stayed after she died because leaving felt like losing her twice, and I couldn't afford that. And then the ranch started failing, and I couldn't afford to leave for different reasons. And by the time I sent that notice to Cartwell, I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore. I just knew I needed something to change." The heifer shifted. Both of them watched her. She resettled, and her breathing eased fractionally. "You got one response," Beatrice said. "The right one," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't write back," she said. "I'd answered 2 other notices before yours. One was a man who wanted a housekeeper and called it ranch management. The other... The situation became clear quickly, and I left." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "Yours was the 3rd. I almost didn't write because I'd started to think the thing I was looking for didn't actually exist." "What were you looking for?" She considered it. "Somewhere I was allowed to be useful," she said. "That sounds simple." "It isn't." He looked at her across the lamp. She was watching the heifer, but she wasn't really watching the heifer, and he could see the tiredness in her face that wasn't just the tiredness of a night with limited sleep, but the older kind, the kind that lives behind the eyes. "You found it," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. I think I did. The heifer was still struggling at noon. Better, possibly. The breathing had evened out slightly and she'd accepted a small amount of water, but not out of danger. Beatrice stayed with her through the afternoon while Gideon dealt with the fence damage the second freeze had done to the western line, where 2 posts had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle and were listing badly enough to be a real problem. He worked in the cold with his aching hands and thought about Clara and about the way this ranch had felt after she'd gone, not just hard, but purposeless, like a tool with no job. And then he thought about the past months and the way the ranch felt now, different, purposeful again, not in the way it had been with Clara, because nothing was ever the same shape twice, but its own new shape, which was solid and real and had 2 names on the documents filed with Helen Vass. He got both posts reset before dark, which was a small victory, but a genuine one, the kind that winter produced in specific denominations. The heifer was standing when he came back to the barn, unsteadily, with the slightly bewildered expression of an animal that had been genuinely ill and was now discovering it was not dead, but standing. Beatrice was at the pen gate watching her. "When did she get up?" he asked. "About an hour ago," Beatrice said. "She's not right yet, but she's through the worst of it, I think." He stood beside her at the gate and looked at the heifer, who was standing in the corner looking back at them with large, dark eyes that held the particular quality of an animal that has survived something and isn't entirely sure how. "2 for 2, he said. Beatrice looked at him. "The roan in September," he said. "Now this one." She looked back at the heifer. "Don't make it a record," she said. "Records invite testing." But she was almost smiling. December settled in with the grim permanence of a season that has no interest in your schedule. The work was unrelenting in the specific way that winter ranch work was unrelenting. Not dramatic mostly, just constant. Water every morning, feed management every day, fence checks after every significant wind. The storage barn tracking carefully against Beatrice's projections, which had been built with enough margin that they were managing, but only because of the October preparations that had seemed excessive at the time and now seemed exactly sufficient. Neighbors began showing up, not intrusively and not all at once, but in the accumulating way of people who have been watching something from a distance and have decided to move closer. McCready sent one of his hands over with a question about hay storage technique, specifically Beatrice's method of layering with the air gaps she'd described to McCready during their November visit. Beatrice explained it in the yard for 20 minutes while the hand took notes on a scrap of paper, and then the hand asked 2 follow-up questions that were actually good questions, and Beatrice answered those too without any sense of grudging about it. The hand went back and apparently reported the conversation accurately because McCready himself appeared 3 days later with a question about the late-season preservation Beatrice had done with the garden harvest. He came in and sat at the table. He asked his questions carefully and listened to the answers without interruption. He and Beatrice went back and forth on the specific timing of root vegetable preservation in relation to the first hard freeze for about 40 minutes, and Gideon sat at the end of the table drinking coffee and watching 2 serious, knowledgeable people talk about something they both understood and feeling the specific pleasure of a thing that was exactly what it appeared to be. "You're going to have more visitors," McCready said when he was putting his coat on to leave. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Beatrice. "We don't mind," she said. "You should charge for the advice," he said. "Not as a joke." Beatrice looked at him steadily. "Not yet," she said. "Not while the operation is still building." He nodded once, with the particular respect of a man who recognizes patience as strategy. Porter Wills came over about the water trough cover design. He'd seen theirs from the road and wanted to understand the angle calculation for the morning sun. Gideon took him out and showed him while Beatrice watched from the doorway and occasionally called out a correction to his explanation that was accurate every time. Even Harmon, delivering a supplemental feed order in mid-December, stopped longer than a delivery required and ended up at the kitchen table being shown how Beatrice tracked feed efficiency against daily temperature, a relationship she'd started charting in October that now, 2 months in, showed patterns that were actually useful for anticipating consumption spikes before they happened. "This is the kind of thing I should be doing for all my clients," Harmon said, looking at the chart. "You should," Beatrice agreed. It saves you from emergency orders and saves them from overpaying. Harmon looked at the chart for another moment. Could I get a copy of the format? She made him one that afternoon. Gideon watched all of this with the quiet attention of a man learning something. The thing he was learning was not about cattle or feed or preservation or water troughs. Those things he was learning too, constantly, from proximity to someone who thought about them more thoroughly than anyone he'd known. But what he was really watching was the way the valley was reorganizing itself around her presence, the way water reorganizes around a new stone dropped in a stream, finding new paths, adjusting, settling into a different configuration than it had before. She wasn't doing it on purpose. That was the thing. She was just doing her work, answering questions honestly, sharing what she knew because someone had asked for it. But the cumulative effect of that, of a woman who had been dismissed on sight now being quietly consulted by the most experienced ranchers in the valley, was something he thought about in the evenings after she'd gone to her room. He thought about Roland Mercer and his story about Charity wearing business clothes. He thought about the two names on the Helen Vass documents. He thought about Clara saying the land had good bones. He thought about all of it the way you think about things that connect to each other in ways you're still working out. The crisis that nearly undid everything came on the 22nd of December, which was, in Gideon's experience, exactly the kind of timing that situations like this preferred. He woke to the sound of cattle, not the normal sound of cattle in the early morning, the settled shifts and low calls of animals going about their business. This was different. This was the sound of distress, collective and urgent, and it brought him out of bed and into his coat before he was fully awake. He nearly ran into Beatrice in the hallway. She was already dressed. They went out together into the dark. What they found was a fence failure. Not a post or two, not a manageable section, but a full 40-foot collapse along the north boundary where the freeze-thaw cycling had finally worked 3 consecutive post foundations loose, and the tension of the wire had done the rest. The cattle that had been grazing the night field had pushed through the gap with the unanimous logic of livestock that see an opening, and the count was not all present. Gideon held the lamp while Beatrice counted. Twice. 14 missing, she said. He looked at the dark boundary. Beyond the downed fence, the land ran north toward a drainage area that was particularly inhospitable in the winter. Low ground that pooled and froze and had brush that animals could get stuck in. I'll go north, he said. We'll go north, she said. Beatrice, don't, she said, and was already walking. They went north together in the dark and the cold, carrying 2 lamps between them, and found the missing cattle in 3 separate groups over the course of an hour and a half. The first group of 7 was not far from the fence line, apparently unsure what to do with their freedom and regretting the decision. They came back reasonably willingly. The second group of 5 was further in, near the drainage area's edge, and required more persuasion and a circuit around them that took 30 minutes and left both Gideon and Beatrice wading through snow that came above the knee. The last 2 were the problem. They'd gone into the drainage brush. Not deep enough to be seriously stuck, but enough that getting them out required physical work in a dark, low space where the footing was uncertain and the cold had the particular malice of a place that didn't get sun. Beatrice went in after them. Gideon held both lamps and talked her through it from the edge, directing her toward the animals by the sound of movement and the weak lamplight, and she worked them out of the brush with the patient, physical urgency of someone who understood that cold and stuck are a combination that doesn't wait. She got both animals out. She came out of the drainage brush behind them with ice on her coat and mud on her hands, and her breath coming in hard, visible bursts. Gideon handed her a lamp. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, breathing hard. "Cold. We need to get back." "The cattle first." "The cattle are out." "The fence," she said. "We can't leave the gap." He looked at her, at the mud on her coat, at the ice on the wool wrap around her neck. "Beatrice." "Gideon." Her voice was level, but he could hear the tiredness in it, the kind that comes from an hour and a half of cold, hard work in the dark. "The fence." They went back and did an emergency repair on the collapsed section. Not a proper repair, which would wait for daylight and better conditions, but enough to close the gap. Gideon drove posts with a mallet while Beatrice held the lamp and the wire, and his arms were aching badly by the end of it, and he suspected hers were too, and neither of them said anything about it. By the time they got back inside, it was past 4 in the morning. Beatrice stood at the kitchen counter and poured water into the basin to wash the mud from her hands. Gideon put the kettle on. They were both shaking slightly. Not dramatically, just the persistent low tremor of bodies that had been cold for too long. He set a cup of hot water on the counter beside her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple thing. She said thank you to practical gestures regularly. It was one of the consistent courtesies of her manner, but this one had a different quality to it, and he felt it. "You went into the drainage brush at 3 in the morning," he said. "The alternative was leaving them." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just—" He stopped, trying to find the right word. "I noticed." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know you did," she said quietly. They drank their hot water standing at the counter, too tired to sit, not quite ready to go back to bed, existing in the particular companionship of people who have just come through something difficult together and haven't fully let it go yet. "The fence needs proper repair tomorrow," she said eventually. "I know." 3 posts minimum, possibly 5. "I know. The ground's going to be hard." "I know, Beatrice." She looked at her cup. "I'm just thinking out loud." "I know," he said more gently. She looked at him, and this time the tiredness was visible in a way she usually managed to keep covered. The real tiredness, the one underneath the practical tiredness. He'd seen it before, in pieces, but not quite this directly. "Go to bed," he said. "The fence will be there at first light." She set her cup down. 4 posts, she said. "I want to check the south corner posts too, while we're at it." 4 posts, he agreed. South corner too. She went down the hall. He stood in the kitchen for a while after, listening to the wind against the windows and the cattle that were back in the right field, making the normal sounds of animals that had been mildly adventurous and were now ready to be ordinary again. He thought about Beatrice in the drainage brush at 3 in the morning with ice on her coat, going after 2 animals because the alternative was leaving them. He thought about it the way you turn a stone over to look at both sides, not to examine it exactly, but because something about it kept asking to be looked at. He went to bed eventually. He slept better than he'd expected. The fence repair took most of the following day. The ground was exactly as hard as Beatrice had predicted, which meant the post work was slow and punishing. Gideon's shoulders were speaking to him by mid-morning in language he was choosing to ignore. Beatrice ran the wire with the focused efficiency she brought to physical work, not fast but consistently, without wasted motion. McCready's hand came past on an errand and stopped to help without being asked, which was the kind of thing that happened in ranch country and was not nothing. He stayed 2 hours and drove 2 of the posts himself, which cut the work meaningfully, and when he left he said only "looking solid" and rode on. By 3 in the afternoon the fence was repaired properly, all 5 posts secure, the wire taut and clean. Beatrice walked the line once, testing each post with a firm push. "Good," she said. They walked back across the north field toward the house. "The cattle count's at 51 now," she said. He looked at her. "The heifer's going to calve in late February," she said. "I've been watching the signs. If she carries to term, 52. He stopped walking, 52. From 41 in September, when the ranch had been hemorrhaging money and hope in approximately equal quantities. "You knew about the heifer," he said. "I suspected. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." She looked at him. "She's healthy enough. The November illness may have set things back slightly, but I think she'll carry." He looked across the north field at the cattle grazing in the late afternoon light, which was the particular low gold of a December sun that didn't have much height to work with. 60, he said. She looked at him. "By summer," he said. "If the heifer carries, and we get 1 more calf from the roan, and we use the Harmon relationship to bring in 2 or 3 head in March." 60 is aggressive, she said. "You said 60 to Harmon when you renegotiated the feed contract," he said. "Said we'd be back at 60 by spring." She was quiet. "Were you guessing?" he asked. "I was projecting," she said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A guess doesn't have a ledger behind it," she said. He looked at her. "So 60 is possible," she said. If we're careful and the weather cooperates and the heifer carries. A pause. And if we put in the work. We put in the work, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, measuring gaze he'd come to understand as the one she used when she was deciding something. Yes, she said, we do. They walked back to the house. The cold was deepening toward evening the way December cold did, settling in layers, and the lamps inside made the windows warm and the house visible from the field as something specific and inhabited, a place that was occupied by intention, not just circumstance. Christmas came quietly, as it generally did on working ranches where the season didn't pause for sentiment. Beatrice made a particular effort with dinner that evening. Not elaborate, not showy, but careful. She'd been storing a few things specifically for it, a canned fruit she'd put up in October, a bread that used the last of a flour supply she'd been rationing, a cut of beef from their own stock that she'd aged properly in the cold storage and prepared with the serious attention she brought to anything she decided was worth doing right. Gideon ate and thought that it was the best meal he'd had in 4 years. He almost said so and then thought that might be too much. He said so anyway. Beatrice looked at him across the table with the slight surprise she showed when he said something more direct than she was expecting. Thank you, she said. They sat at the table after the meal was done, the way you sit when you're not quite ready to let an evening go. McCready invited us to his place for New Year's, Gideon said. I know, he asked me on Tuesday. She straightened her coffee cup on the table. Do you want to go? I think we should. It matters being visible in the community, especially now. She nodded. I think so too. Plus, he said, I think his wife wants to meet you. Beatrice looked at him. He mentioned it, Gideon said. She's been asking. Apparently she has opinions about the hay storage method. Her opinions are probably correct, Beatrice said. She's been doing this longer than I have. He looked at her. That doesn't bother you? That someone might know more? Why would it? She seemed genuinely puzzled. If she knows something useful, I want to hear it. He thought about Roland Mercer and his confident certainties. Then he thought about Beatrice Hollow, who had walked into a failing ranch in September and immediately started asking what was wrong with it. We'll go to McCready's, he said. Yes, she said. They sat a while longer. Outside, the wind was quiet for once, which was unusual for December, and the cold was the still kind rather than the moving kind, which made it feel slightly less aggressive. In the barn, the cattle were settled. In the separated pen, the heifer was standing and gaining weight and carrying, in all probability, the 52nd animal. Gideon looked across the table at Beatrice, who was looking at nothing in particular with the expression she had in quiet moments. Not absent, just resting, the quality of someone who worked hard enough that stillness, when it came, was genuinely still. He had something he'd been carrying around for several weeks without saying, which was unlike him. He was generally a more direct person than that, but this particular thing had needed time to become clear, and it had been becoming clear slowly, the way most important things did, through accumulation and proximity rather than any single moment. He thought about saying it now. Then he thought about the ledger on the table, and the 51 cattle, and the heifer that was probably carrying, and the January work that was still ahead of them, and the fence that had been repaired, and the hay that was holding, and the agreements that were filed with Helen Vass. He thought, there's a right time for things, and the right time for this particular thing wasn't a December evening after a hard month, when they were both tired and the year wasn't finished yet. There was still winter to get through. He picked up his cup. What's the priority for January, Schut? He asked. Beatrice looked at him, and he thought for a moment she might have known what he'd been about to say, and chosen not to make it difficult for him. The south fence corner, she said, and the water system. I want to improve the trough cover before the next serious freeze, and the heifer needs monitoring from here forward. And the Harmon quarterly accounting. That's the second week of January. She opened the ledger. I want to add 2 columns to the format. I've been tracking something that I think will be useful to show him. He leaned over to look at where she was pointing. She explained it to him for 10 minutes, a new way of correlating feed costs against weather patterns and cattle health that she'd been developing since October, which was characteristically Beatrice in that it was both more complicated and more useful than anything the straightforward numbers would have suggested. He asked questions. She answered them. The lamp burned low, and they trimmed it, and it burned steady. The ranch was quiet around them, doing what ranches do in the deep of winter, existing stubbornly, insisting on its own continuation, holding its ground against the cold. January came in hard and stayed that way. The second week brought a cold snap that made December feel like a rehearsal. Temperatures that cracked the water in the barn troughs overnight despite the covers, that drove the cattle into tight clusters in the north field, that made the morning work feel like moving through something solid rather than through air. Gideon's hands stopped aching and went to a deeper complaint, the kind that settled into the bones and didn't leave until April, and he stopped noticing it because there was no point in noticing something that wasn't going to change. Beatrice's new ledger columns went to Harmon in the second week as planned. She'd spent 3 evenings finishing the format, a correlation chart showing feed consumption against temperature drops and cattle weight tracking, laid out in a grid that made the relationship between those 3 variables visible in a way that plain numbers didn't. Harmon looked at it for a long time without speaking, turning the pages with the careful attention of a man who deals in quantities and recognizes when someone has made quantities tell a better story than they usually do. "Can I show this to my other clients?" he asked finally. "The format, yes," Beatrice said. "The specific numbers are ours." "Of course." He set it down. "Where did you learn this?" "I made it up," she said. "I kept tracking the variables and eventually the relationship became obvious enough to chart." Harmon looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing more frequently in recent months, something between respect and mild bewilderment, the look of a man encountering a category he doesn't have an existing slot for. The quarterly accounting was clean, cleaner than any quarter Gideon had run on this property since Clara had been alive, and possibly cleaner than those, because Beatrice had a precision with numbers that went beyond competence into something closer to fluency. The way some people read text, and some people read it and simultaneously understand the architecture underneath it. After Harmon left, Gideon sat with the finalized quarterly figures and let himself look at them directly for the first time in what felt like years. He'd been looking at numbers for months, every day, every week, but always as a working document, always as a problem to be managed. This time he looked at them as a record of what had happened. September to January, 4 months. The numbers told a story that he found difficult to look at without something catching in his chest. He didn't say anything about it. Beatrice was in the barn checking on the heifer, who was moving through the middle stage of her pregnancy with the determined solidity of an animal that had been ill in November and had apparently decided to compensate for it by being aggressively healthy now. He went to help her. The heifer calved on the 28th of February, which was 2 days earlier than Beatrice had estimated, and in the middle of a night that had decided to be inconvenient about the temperature. Beatrice had been checking her every evening for a week, reading the signs with the patient expertise she'd developed over a winter of close attention. On the 27th, she came in from the barn at 9 in the evening and said, "Tomorrow or the day after," with the certainty of someone whose predictions had earned the right to be taken as fact. It was the day after, at 2 in the morning. Gideon woke to her hand on his shoulder. He was dressed and moving before full consciousness caught up. They spent 3 hours in the barn with the heifer, and it was not easy. The presentation was slightly wrong, and Beatrice had to work to correct it, talking steadily in the low, practical voice she used with animals under stress, her hands doing things that required a specific kind of knowledge and a specific kind of calm. Gideon held the lamp and did what she told him when she told him, and stayed out of the way when staying out of the way was the right thing. At 4:50 in the morning, the calf was on the ground, breathing, small and wet and furious looking in the way of newborns, who seemed to arrive in the world with a specific grievance about it. The heifer turned to it immediately with the focused attention of a mother who has been waiting and is now, despite all the difficulty, ready. Beatrice sat back on her heels and looked at the calf. Gideon looked at Beatrice. She was exhausted in a visible, bone-deep way. Her arms were shaking slightly, the fine tremor of muscles that had been working hard at a delicate task for 3 hours. There was straw in her hair. Her coat was a situation he'd deal with later. 52, she said quietly. 52, he agreed. She sat there for a moment longer, watching the calf find its legs, and her face had an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the reserved competence she showed in difficult moments, not the steady practicality of a woman moving through problems efficiently. Something softer, something that was allowed to be soft because the crisis was over and the thing that had needed to live was living. He sat down on the straw beside her, not touching, just beside her, in the lamp warmth, with the calf working out the mechanics of standing and the heifer doing what mothers do. After a while she said, "Clara would have liked this." He looked at her. "You told me she's the one who wanted the ranch," Beatrice said. "The good bones." She was still watching the calf. Someone who sees potential in difficult things usually recognizes it when it appears. He didn't trust his voice for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "She would have." They sat together in the straw until first light was coming through the barn gaps, and the calf was standing steadily, and the heifer had settled. Then Beatrice got up and started checking the water situation, and Gideon went to start the morning, and the ranch continued being a ranch, which was what it was and what it was going to keep being. But something had shifted again, in the specific way that things between them kept shifting. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the accumulated weight of small true things building towards something that couldn't stay unacknowledged much longer. March came in with a particular mixed character of a month that hasn't decided yet. Cold mornings and afternoons that occasionally remembered warmth, mud that tested every boot in the operation and won most of the contests. The cattle that Gideon brought in from a contact of Harmon's in early March, 3 good animals at a price that the long-term agreement made manageable, brought the count to 55, and the pasture rotation that Beatrice had been developing since September was finally running the way she'd designed it, each section getting the rest it needed, the grass responding the way grass responds when someone pays attention to what it needs. The valley had reconfigured. That was the only way Gideon could describe it. The Cross Ranch had occupied a particular position in the valley's understanding for years. The struggling place, the one with the bad luck, the one that reasonable people expected to eventually consolidate into someone else's property. That position had quietly ceased to apply at some point over the winter, and in its place was something different. Not famous, not dramatic, just present in a new way. McCready's wife, Ruth, had become Beatrice's most substantive professional contact in the valley. She was a small, direct woman in her 60s who had been ranching since before most of the valley's current operators were born, and she and Beatrice had developed a working exchange of practical knowledge that Gideon found genuinely fascinating to observe. 2 people who thought about the same problems from slightly different angles, each finding the other's angle useful. Ruth came by one Tuesday in March, officially to return a borrowing of a specific preservation jar Beatrice had lent in January, actually to continue a conversation about spring pasture management that had been going on in installments since New Year's. Gideon made coffee and largely stayed out of it. At some point, Ruth looked at him over her cup with the sharp, appraising look of a woman who has been paying attention to more than the official subject of the conversation. "You know what the valley used to say about this place?" she said to him directly. "I know," he said. "They don't say it anymore," she said. "In case you were wondering." He looked at her. "Now they ask how she did it," Ruth said, "which I consider an improvement, though it's still the wrong question." "What's the right question?" Gideon asked. Ruth McCready gave him the look of a woman who expects a smart man to get there on his own and is slightly disappointed that he's asking. "The right question," she said, "is what you're both going to do next." She finished her coffee and left, and Gideon sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. Quote, he found the right moment at the end of March, on an evening that felt like the actual beginning of spring, the first evening when the cold wasn't a fact to be managed, but just a quality of the air, present but not pressing. The mud was still asserting itself, but the grass was starting in the south field, the faint green beginning of something that had been underground all winter and was now deciding it was time. Beatrice was on the porch when he came up from the barn. She was looking at the south field with the evaluating attention she brought to the land generally, not admiring it exactly, but reading it, the way she read the ledger pages or a sick animal or a weather shift. He came and stood beside her. They stood in the evening quiet for a while, which was normal for them. The comfortable quality of silence between people who have shared enough difficult hours that silence doesn't need filling. "The Southfield's coming in earlier than last year," she said. "Yes." If it holds, we can start the rotation 2 weeks ahead of schedule. That buys us better forage going into summer. Good. She looked at him sideways. He had the feeling she could tell something was different in his manner because she generally could. She had a finely calibrated sense for shifts in the atmosphere around her, which probably came from spending years in situations where reading the room was a necessary skill. "There's something you've been carrying around," she said. Not a question. "For about 3 months," he said. She turned to look at him fully. He looked at her. At the face he'd been looking at across kitchen tables and barn floors and muddy fields for 7 months. The face that had become, without announcement or drama, one of the most important faces in his life. Not because it was soft, though it had its softness. Not because it was easy, though she made hard things look that way. Because it was honest. Because it was capable. Because it belonged to someone who had looked at a failing ranch and seen what it could be, and then had done the work to make it that, and had not required him to be perfect in the process. "I don't want to renegotiate this arrangement," he said. She waited. "Not the partnership," he said. "That stays. That's not what I'm talking about." He looked at her steadily. "I want the rest of it to be permanent, too." Beatrice Hollow held his gaze for a long moment in the cooling March evening. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I want to say that clearly before anything else. I've been living with you for 7 months. I know. I mean, permanently. I'm particular about the ledger. I'll always have opinions about the fence and the water and the cattle rotation. I don't stop working when I should." She looked at the field. "And I've been someone's idea of a problem to be solved for most of my adult life. And I haven't always come out of that without," she paused, "complications." "I know," he said. "You know some of it." "I know enough," he said, "and I know you." She looked at him. 7 months, he said. The roan at midnight, the drainage brush at 3 in the morning, the heifer in February. 55 cattle, 52 of which exist partly because of your hands. He paused. "I know you, Beatrice, not perfectly, but truly. And that's what I want. Not perfect. True." The south field was going green in the last of the evening light. The barn behind them was solid and repaired. Somewhere in the north pasture, the roan was doing what she did at this hour, which was walking a slow perimeter in the way she always had, the particular habit of an animal that had survived something and seemed to want to confirm regularly that the world was still in order. Beatrice looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the weight of it, the genuine weight of a woman who doesn't make decisions carelessly, making one that wasn't going to be undone. "Together," she said. "All of it. Together." "That's what I want," he said. She was quiet for one more moment. "All right," she said, not dramatically, not with tears or speeches, just with the same directness she brought to every real thing. And that was exactly right, because she was who she was, and he had been paying attention to who she was for 7 months. He took her hand. She let him. They stood on the porch together, looking at the south field going dark and the first star coming through, and it was not a perfect moment. His other hand had a new blister from the morning fence work, and her coat had a tear at the left elbow she hadn't gotten around to mending. But it was a true one, and true was better. They married in late April. Helen Vass handled the legal portion, because of course she did, and the ceremony itself was held on the ranch property because neither of them had any interest in doing it somewhere else. The south field was fully green by then, genuinely green, the kind of color that April produces when winter has finally finished its argument and the land is allowed to be what it actually is. McCready and Ruth came. Porter and Delia Wills came, and Delia had been making up for the garden conversation since November in the way of a woman who regrets something practical and addresses regret through practical means. She brought enough preserved food to stock the kitchen for a month, which Beatrice accepted with genuine gratitude and no trace of irony. Harmon came. Marin Hobbs came from the post office and stood in the back in her good coat, looking satisfied in the specific way of someone who was present at the conclusion of a story they'd watched developing for a while. Several of McCready's hands who had helped with the fence and the hay and various other winter crises came, because in ranch country, the people who have worked alongside you are the people who matter, and they had. It was not a large gathering, but every person in it was there because they had been present for something real, not because of occasion or obligation, and Gideon thought that was exactly the right size. Ruth McCready stood beside Beatrice before the ceremony in the way older women sometimes stand beside younger ones at significant moments, not to advise or instruct, just to be a steady presence. "Nervous?" Ruth asked. "No," Beatrice said honestly. Ruth looked at her. "Good," she said. "Nerves are for when you're not sure. You're sure." "I'm sure," Beatrice said. And she was. That was the thing that Gideon had noticed first and understood later. Beatrice Hollow was almost never sure of things that deserved uncertainty and almost always sure of things that deserved certainty. It made her occasionally difficult and consistently worth trusting. After, people ate at the long table they'd set up outside, and there was more conversation than Gideon could track and more laughter than he'd expected, and Ruth and Beatrice spent 45 minutes in the corner discussing the spring rotation plan in their usual manner, which Gideon thought was probably the most characteristic thing that could have happened at his wedding, and therefore perfect. He stood with McCready at one point, looking at the property. "It's changed," McCready said. "Yes. I mean more than the fence and the cattle count." McCready looked at him. "The whole thing has a different character, like it knows what it is now." Gideon looked at his ranch, the repaired barn, the organized sheds, the garden beds that were already being prepared for the spring planting, the south field where the rotation was running properly for the first time since he'd owned the land, the cattle visible and healthy and multiplying. "It does," he said. "That came from her," McCready said, not reductively, just accurately. "It came from both of us," Gideon said. "But she started it." McCready nodded. He understood about things that started somewhere specific and then became shared. Ruth had started a great many things on his operation that he now considered simply theirs. But Roland Mercer's name came up one final time. It was Marin Hobbs who mentioned it on her way out at the end of the evening in the way she delivered most information, incidentally, as part of something else. "I heard he sold the Caldwell County property," she said, pulling on her coat. "Moving east, apparently. Something about a business arrangement that didn't work out." Gideon looked at her. "I don't know details," she said. "Just what came through." She looked at Beatrice. "I thought you might want to know." Beatrice stood for a moment with that information. "Thank you, Marin," she said. After Marin left, Gideon stood beside Beatrice in the yard while the last of the guests were saying their goodbyes. The evening was cooling the way April evenings did. Gently, not urgently, the cold still there, but no longer dominant. "Does it change anything?" he asked. "About Mercer? About the news?" She thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about everything. "No," she said. "It just closes the account." He understood what she meant. There are people who move through your life causing damage and then recede, and you can spend energy tracking them, or you can let them recede. Mercer had done what he'd done. The letters, the visit, the campaign through Caldwell County to undermine what they were building, and it had come to nothing, not because he was defeated dramatically, but because the thing he'd tried to undermine had simply continued to exist and strengthen until there was nothing left for his story to attach to. The ground had been too solid, the paperwork too clean, the relationships too real. He had run out of gap between what people assumed and what was true, because they had closed the gap, document by document, season by season, one difficult morning at a time. That was the thing about people like Roland Mercer. They operated on the difference between appearance and reality, on what a person looked like before you knew what they could do. They needed that gap. They needed you to stay in the space of being underestimated. And the only response that actually worked, the only one that couldn't be argued with or talked around or repositioned, was to keep doing the work until the gap no longer existed. Beatrice had understood that from the beginning. Gideon had come to understand it by watching her. Tachin. Summer settled over the valley in the full, deliberate way of a season that knows it has time. The cattle count reached 58 by June, with 2 additional calves and the purchase of 1 more animal through the McCready network. Not 60, which had been the target, but close enough to see it from where they were standing, and the quality of the herd was better than the raw numbers suggested. Healthier animals, better rotation, a feed program that the Harmon chart was now tracking with the kind of precision that made problems visible before they became crises. The garden was the best it had been. Beatrice had expanded it again in April, taking over a section of the south yard that had been used for nothing in particular, and what it was producing now was enough to supply the household through winter with surplus for trade. She'd started an informal arrangement with 3 neighboring families, produce in exchange for labor during the fall harvest weeks, which gave them more hands when they needed them and gave the neighbors food security that the valley's dry summers sometimes threatened. People came to the Cross Ranch now the way people came to places that had become known for something worth knowing. McCready brought 2 ranchers from the Dunbar area in July, men he was trying to convince about a collective supply arrangement, and the stop at the Cross operation was clearly part of his case for how the arrangement could work. He wanted them to see what coordinated supply management looked like when it was done right. Beatrice talked to them for an hour about the Harmon Agreement and the correlation charts and the seasonal pricing structure. And by the end of it, one of the Dunbar ranchers was asking if she'd be willing to consult on their own feed contracts. She said she'd think about it. Later that evening, after the Dunbar men had left with McCready, Gideon found her on the porch with her ledger, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she wasn't writing in it, she was just holding it. He sat beside her. "The Dunbar offer," he said. "I know," she said. "It's worth considering." "I know that too." She looked at the field. "I just want to make sure what we have here is solid before I start contributing it somewhere else." "It's solid," he said. She looked at him. "Beatrice?" He said it simply. "Look at it." She looked at the ranch in the late summer evening, the barn that stood straight, the fence lines that held, the garden that was producing, the cattle that were healthy, the accounts that were balanced, the agreements that were filed and real and no longer vulnerable to a well-dressed man's opinion. "It is," she said quietly. "It is solid." "Whatever you want to do with the Dunbar offer," he said, "whatever you want to do next. That's what we do." She looked at him with the expression that had started as an almost smile in September, and had, over the course of 9 months of difficult and true and occasionally muddy work, become something he could read completely. Not just the surface of it, but the whole thing. "We should add a section to the east side," she said. "The soil tests I ran in May suggest it could support a different crop rotation that would reduce our winter feed dependency." "All right, and the barn needs a structural assessment before fall. I've been watching a beam on the west side." "I know the one." "And the heifer's calf is going to need separate management this winter." "We'll figure it out." She turned the ledger in her hands. "There's a lot of work still." "There always will be," he said. "That's not a problem. That's the thing." She looked at him. "The work is the thing," he said. "It's not in the way of the life. It is the life. And it's a good one." Beatrice Hollow. Beatrice Cross, now, though she'd kept both names on every professional document because she'd earned both and saw no reason to choose, looked at her husband in the late summer evening and held that in for a moment. The truth of it. The ordinary, difficult, unglamorous truth of a life built through accumulated days of showing up and doing what needed doing. She had left Harlan County looking for a place where she was allowed to be useful. She had found something larger than that, a place where she was essential and known, and where the knowing had happened through the real substance of what she was rather than through anyone's willingness to imagine past what she looked like. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the specific thing she had not been sure existed when she'd almost not written back to the notice posted in Cartwell. She thought about what it had taken to get here, the decisions that had seemed unremarkable at the time, the letter written, the wagon boarded, the first afternoon spent walking a failing property and saying out loud what she saw wrong with it, the midnight hours and the cold mornings and the ledger columns and the conversations that mattered more than they'd announced themselves as mattering. There was no single moment that had made this. There were only all the moments, added together, and the people who had kept showing up for them. "The east section," she said finally. "We should survey it this week while the light is good." "This week," he agreed. She opened the ledger. He looked out at the south field where the cattle were settling for the evening, the roan among them making her slow perimeter walk, checking that things were where she'd left them. Some things you build so gradually you can't point to when they became what they are. You look back and there's the before, the failing ranch, the single reply to a notice, the woman stepping off the wagon into a yard full of quiet judgment, and there's the after, which is this evening, this porch, these two people, and this ledger, and the 58 cattle, and the agreements, and the repaired fences, and the life that is genuinely theirs. Between the before and the after is not a single thing. It is every morning that didn't quit, every problem that got met, every conversation that chose honesty over ease. It is the understanding, earned through difficulty and not available any other way, that strength is not always loud, and capability is not always what people first recognize, and that the most durable things are built not in moments of inspiration, but in the long, ordinary, unglamorous commitment to showing up. Beatrice knew this. She had always known it. Gideon had learned it from her. He thought that was probably how it was supposed to work. Not one person saving another, but two people who had both seen something real in the other and had trusted that seeing and had built accordingly. The lamp came on inside the house as the last of the light left the field. The ranch settled into its evening. It was theirs, fully and without condition. And there was still, as there always would be, a great deal of work to do.